Welcome to a night of adventure and wonder. Close your eyes and let the winds of the northern reaches guide you into a world where frost whispers secrets and treasures lie hidden beneath icy halls. Tonight, we set sail aboard the Frostfire, where Captain Lysander Vane dares to challenge the Snow Queen herself. Let the rhythm of the waves and the crackle of ice lull you into a dream, as the story of courage, redemption, and the cost of desire unfolds. Breathe deeply, relax, and drift into the heart of the tale. The northern reaches were no place for the faint of heart. Endless stretches of white swallowed the horizon, and winds howled like restless spirits. Yet, there Captain Lysander Vane stood at the bow of the Frostfire, his dark coat flaring like a banner of defiance. He had heard the whispers, rumors of a treasure buried deep within the glacial halls of the Snow Queen's domain. Jewels that could rival the stars, a crown that could command the seas themselves. The stories had drawn him here, to the edge of the world, where even the sun feared to tread. Behind him, the crew muttered uneasily. They were hardened men and women, accustomed to storms and cannon fire. But this journey had stirred something primal within them. The biting cold seemed alive, creeping through the thickest layers and burrowing into their very bones. The Snow Queen was no myth to these sailors. She was a spectre of the icy wastes, a warden of a realm where mortals dared not tread. "Captain," First Mate Roshan called, his voice steady despite the frost forming on his beard. "The men grow restless. They say the ice watches us." Lysander turned, his piercing green eyes narrowing. "Let it watch. If the ice has eyes, then it can witness our triumph. We're close, Roshan. I can feel it." But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt curled at the edge of his thoughts. The northern reaches were more than hostile. They were forbidding. Every step closer to their destination felt like an intrusion into sacred ground. Still, Lysander's ambition burned brighter than any caution. It always had. The storm came with no warning. One moment, the skies were a pale, indifferent grey. The next, they were a tempest of swirling snow and shrieking wind. The crew scrambled to secure the sails as icy gusts threatened to tear the ship apart. Lysander barked orders, his voice a whip cutting through the chaos. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm ceased. Silence fell over the frozen sea, a silence so profound it seemed to press against their ears. The ship rocked gently in the calm, and a crystalline stillness settled over the world. "Captain," Roshan murmured, pointing toward the horizon. "Look." A figure emerged from the haze of snow. A woman, pale and radiant, gliding across the ice as if it were a ballroom floor. Her gown shimmered like frost under moonlight, and her hair cascaded in silvery waves. Her eyes, sharp as icicles, locked onto Lysander with an intensity that pierced through the distance. The Snow Queen. "Bold of you to trespass," she said, her voice as cold and smooth as a blade drawn from ice. She stood at the edge of the ship's shadow, her feet never disturbing the snow beneath them. "And bolder still to seek what is not yours." Lysander stepped forward, his chin high. "I am Captain Lysander Vane, master of the Frostfire. The treasures of this world belong to those with the will to claim them." The Snow Queen's laughter was soft, like the crackle of frost spreading over glass. "Treasures? Is that all you see? Greed has blinded greater men than you, Captain." "I don't care for riddles," he snapped. "I've come for the treasure said to lie within your domain. Name your price." Her smile faded. "There is no price for what you seek, only a cost." The air grew colder, the frost thickening on the ship's rails. The crew shivered, drawing closer to the lanterns for warmth, but Lysander held his ground. "Enough games. I'll take what's mine, or I'll carve it from this frozen wasteland myself." The Snow Queen tilted her head, as though examining a curious insect. Then, with a flick of her hand, the air between them shimmered, and an ornate chest appeared on the ice. It gleamed with an otherworldly light, its surface etched with runes that seemed to writhe like living things. "Take it then," she said softly. "But know this, to carry treasure is to carry its weight. And you, Captain, are already burdened." Lysander stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frost-coated deck. His hand reached for the chest, but the moment his fingers brushed its surface, an icy pain shot through him. He staggered back, gasping as frost crawled up his arm. "You cannot take what you do not understand," the Snow Queen said, her voice suddenly harsh. She raised her hand, and a storm of frost and snow enveloped Lysander. His crew cried out as ice spread across the ship, freezing sails, ropes, and rails in an instant. When the storm cleared, the Snow Queen was gone. The Frostfire was trapped in a sea of ice, its sails frozen solid, and Lysander clutched his arm, the frostbite spreading as if alive. A single word, etched in frost on the ship's helm, shimmered in the pale light. "Redemption!" The frost that encased Captain Lysander Vane's arm seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Pale veins of ice crept along his skin, cold enough to burn. He clenched his jaw against the pain, his breath fogging in the frozen air. Around him, the Frostfire groaned under the weight of the Snow Queen's wrath. The sails hung in rigid sheets of ice, the ropes brittle as spun glass. The ship was no longer a vessel, but a prisoner. Roshan approached cautiously, his boots crunching over the frost-covered deck. "Captain," he said, his voice trembling, What is happening to you?" Lysander shook his head, unable to find words. The icy tendrils climbed higher, creeping toward his shoulder, and with them came a hollow chill that seeped into his chest. It wasn't just his body that was freezing. it was his spirit. He staggered toward the helm, his boots slipping on the frost. There, etched into the wood, was the single word that had appeared in the Snow Queen's wake. Redemption. It glowed faintly, as if it held some secret warmth hidden deep within. "What does it mean?" Roshan asked, peering over Lysander's shoulder. "It's a message," Lysander replied, his voice hoarse. "Or a taunt." As if summoned by his words, a faint light shimmered in the air before him. Slowly, it coalesced into an inscription of frost, its letters forming one by one. "Find the flame of everlasting spring, where snow and fire meet. Only then will you melt the frost within." The letters lingered for a moment before dissipating like breath on a cold night. The next morning, the ship remained ensnared in ice, the surrounding sea a frozen wasteland. The crew worked tirelessly, hacking at the frost with axes and hammers, but the ice refused to yield. Meanwhile, Lysander withdrew to his quarters, poring over maps and half-remembered tales of the mythical flame of everlasting spring. "South," he murmured to himself, tracing a finger along a faded chart. The legend spoke of a land where fire and ice coexisted, a place of eternal contradiction. It was said to lie far beyond the reaches of any known trade route, a secret jealously guarded by nature itself. Roshan entered, his expression grim. "The men are frightened, Captain. They whisper that the Snow Queen's curse will doom us all." Lysander looked up, his green eyes now tinged with the faintest hint of blue. "Let them whisper. I have no intention of dying here." "And what of this flame?" Roshan pressed. "Do you believe it even exists?" "I don't have the luxury of doubt," Lysander replied, rising to his feet. He winced as the frost on his arm flared with pain, spreading tendrils of ice beneath his coat. "The Snow Queen cursed me, but she also gave me a way out. We set sail south as soon as the ice breaks." Roshan hesitated. "And if it doesn't?" Lysander's gaze hardened. "Then I'll walk." The following night, the crew huddled below deck, seeking warmth where there was none. Lysander stood alone on the frozen deck, staring at the unyielding expanse of ice. The cold had numbed him to everything but his thoughts, which turned over and over like the relentless grinding of a millstone. Had he gone too far this time? The pursuit of treasure had always been his guiding star, but now it seemed a cruel and distant light. His greed had led him to this frozen purgatory, and it was his men who paid the price. For the first time he wondered if the cost was too high. A low creaking sound broke the silence. Lysander turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his cutlass. The ice around the ship was shifting, cracks spidering outward like veins. Slowly the frostfire groaned as the frozen grip of the sea began to loosen. He stared in astonishment as the ice parted before the ship, forming a narrow channel of dark water. A faint light glimmered on the horizon, warm and golden, like the first rays of dawn. Lysander didn't need to be told what it meant. "The way is open," he said aloud, his breath misting in the frigid air. By morning, the frostfire was free, sailing cautiously through the narrow channel carved by some unseen force. The crew worked with renewed fervour, their fear tempered by the hope of escape. Lysander stood at the helm, his frostbitten arm concealed beneath layers of fabric, his thoughts consumed by the flame of everlasting spring. But as the ship moved farther south, a new unease settled over him. The frost on his arm had not receded. Instead, it seemed to have grown. It was as though the curse had taken root within him, feeding on something deeper than mere flesh. He tightened his grip on the helm, his resolve hardening. Whatever the cost, he would find the flame. Not just for himself, but for his crew and the ship that had carried him through 100 storms. He had no choice. Spring was coming, and with it, the end of his time. The waters grew darker as the frostfire sailed south, a foreboding current carrying the ship toward a destination none of the crew could name. The frost on Lysander's arm had crept to his shoulder, a constant ache that gnawed at him. Each day his breath came in colder plumes, and his voice seemed tinged with the frost he now carried within. His men cast uneasy glances his way, but said nothing. Their silence weighted with dread. Days passed before the island appeared on the horizon. It rose like a jagged crown from the sea, its cliffs shrouded in a veil of perpetual snow. Even from a distance, the air around it shimmered with cold. Roshan stood at Lysander's side, his expression grim. "The island of eternal winter," he muttered. "I've heard the tales. Ships that approach it never return." "Then we'll be the first," Lysander replied, his voice sharp enough to cut the frigid air. As the ship neared the icy shore, the sea itself began to freeze, forcing the crew to anchor far from land. Lysander led the way, carving a path across the brittle ice with his blade, his men following reluctantly. The frost beneath their boots seemed alive, creaking and groaning as though it disapproved of their intrusion. The island's interior was a labyrinth of frozen spires and snow-covered valleys. Strange shapes loomed in the ice, half-formed figures that seemed caught in the act of reaching, their features blurred by the frost. The crew whispered nervously, their voices hushed as if afraid to wake the slumbering land. "Keep moving," Lysander commanded, though the frost on his arm now spread to his chest, each step a battle against the cold that seeped deeper into him. They came upon a frozen waterfall, its icy cascade suspended mid-flow. At its base, a figure knelt, encased in a thick layer of frost. Lysander approached cautiously, his breath catching as he recognized the frozen remains of a sailor, his hand outstretched towards something buried beneath the ice. Lysander knelt, brushing the snow aside to reveal a leather-bound journal miraculously preserved. He opened it, the pages crackling with frost, and read the faded scroll. The flame of everlasting spring lies within the mountain of ice, but beware, its guardian tests not the body but the soul. Only the pure of heart may pass unscathed. Roshan peered over his shoulder. Pure of heart, he echoed. Doesn't sound like us. Speak for yourself, Lysander snapped, though the words rang hollow. His chest tightened, and not from the cold. He shoved the journal into his coat and stood. We press on. The mountain loomed in the island's center, a monolithic spire of ice that seemed to pierce the sky itself. The ascent was treacherous, the path slick with frost and guarded by the wind's bitter howl. As they climbed, the air grew thinner, the cold sharper, until it felt as though even their thoughts might freeze. The crew's resolve began to waver. One by one they faltered, murmuring prayers to gods they hadn't spoken to in years. Roshan placed a hand on Lysander's shoulder. We should turn back, Captain. This is madness. Lysander shook him off, his eyes fixed on the summit. Madness is dying frozen in place because we lacked the courage to move forward. But deep down, even Lysander felt the weight of doubt pressing against him. The frost on his body had slowed his movements, his fingers stiff and unresponsive. Every step felt heavier, as though the mountain itself sought to break him. At last, they reached the summit. There, in the heart of a crystalline cavern, burned the flame of everlasting spring. It hovered above a pool of molten ice, its light warm and golden, a stark contrast to the frozen world around it. For a moment the crew was silent, awestruck by the sight. But as Lysander stepped forward, the air shimmered, and a figure emerged from the flames. It was humanoid yet otherworldly, its body wreathed in flickering light. The Guardian's eyes, like twin suns, bore into Lysander. Who dares approach the flame? It asked, its voice a thunderous rumble that echoed through the cavern. I am Captain Lysander Vane, he said, his voice steady despite the frost gnawing at his soul. I seek the flame to break the curse upon me. The Guardian tilted its head, its fiery form shifting like the flicker of a candle. Then you must prove your worth. Step forward and bare your soul. Lysander hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Around him, the cavern seemed to hold its breath, the ice reflecting distorted versions of himself, each one colder, crueler than the last. Captain, Roshan whispered, be careful. Lysander took a step forward, the frost on his body crackling like breaking glass. He stared into the Guardian's blazing eyes, knowing that the trial had begun. The air around the flame of everlasting spring was thick with an unnatural heat, a warmth that seemed to press against Lysander's frost-ridden body with equal parts relief and agony. Each step forward was a battle, the frost in his veins screaming in protest against the warmth of the Guardian's gaze. Behind him, his crew lingered at the cavern's edge, their fear keeping them rooted to the icy ground. The guardian's fiery form flickered as it spoke again, its voice resonant and ancient. The flame of everlasting spring burns for those who are worthy. Prove your worth, Captain Lysander Vane, or let the frost within consume you. Lysander squared his shoulders, though the effort sent a fresh wave of icy pain through him. What must I do? The guardian extended an arm, and from its fiery hand a molten mirror formed, its surface rippling like liquid gold. Look into the mirror, it commanded. Face what lies within. Lysander approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the brittle ice beneath him. As he peered into the mirror, the molten surface stilled, and an image began to take shape, a younger version of himself, standing on the deck of a ship engulfed in flames. He recognized the scene instantly. It was a memory he had buried deep, a moment he had never dared to revisit. The cries of his crew echoed faintly in the cavern, their desperate pleas for help, as fire consumed the rigging and smoke choked the air. In the reflection, the younger Lysander stood frozen, his hand clutching a golden pendant. It was the only thing he had managed to save as he abandoned ship, leaving his crew to their fate. The pendant, a gift from his mother, had been his talisman, his symbol of survival. But in that moment, it had been a symbol of his selfishness. You chose the pendant over their lives, the guardian said, its voice like the roar of an inferno. You chose greed over loyalty. Lysander's chest tightened, the frost spreading further as shame clawed at him. I was a different man then, he said hoarsely. A man who thought survival meant taking instead of giving. The guardian's eyes flared. And are you different now? Before Lysander could answer, the mirror rippled again, showing another memory. This time it was the face of a woman. Annalise, the only person who had ever made him feel more than his ambition. She stood on the shore, her expression a mix of sadness and anger as the frostfire sailed away. He had left her too, chasing a treasure he had never found. She begged you to stay, the guardian said, to find your treasure in her love. Yet you sailed away, your heart as cold as the waters you crossed. Lysander clenched his fists, his breath misting in the warm air. The memories burned more fiercely than the flame itself, each one a reminder of the man he had been. He wanted to look away, to turn from the mirror and its relentless truths, but the frost in his chest held him still. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice cracking. To admit I was a monster. I already know that. The guardian's flames dimmed, its form becoming almost shadow-like. Redemption is not a matter of knowing. It is a matter of choice. What will you give to melt the frost within? From the shadows, the mirror vanished, replaced by a small pedestal of ice. Atop it lay the golden pendant, his mother's pendant, the symbol of his greed and survival. Lysander's heart wrenched at the sight. To claim the flame, the guardian intoned, you must sacrifice what you hold most dear. Only then will you be free. Lysander stared at the pendant, his hand instinctively reaching for it. Memories of his mother flooded his mind. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she had pressed the pendant into his palm the day he first set sail. It was the last piece of her he had left. Behind him, Roshan called out, his voice laced with urgency. "Captain, don't do it! There must be another way!" Lysander closed his eyes, his frostbitten hand trembling. There was no other way. The curse had taken everything from him, his strength, his humanity, and it would take his soul if he refused the trial. He had lost his crew once. He would not lose them again. With a deep breath, he placed the pendant on the pedestal. The ice beneath it began to melt, and the flames of the guardian roared to life. "You have chosen," the guardian said, its voice softer now, almost reverent. "The frost within your soul begins to thaw." As the flame of everlasting spring erupted into a radiant glow, Lysander felt warmth flood his body, chasing away the cold that had gripped him. The frost on his arm cracked and fell away, and for the first time in weeks, he could feel his heart beating. But the warmth brought no joy. He turned away from the flame, the cavern filling with its golden light, and stared at the empty pedestal where his pendant had been. Redemption, he realized, was not without cost. The frostfire sailed north again, her hull slicing through the waters that had once imprisoned her. The ice that had encased her had vanished, but the chill of the Snow Queen's curse lingered in the air, its memory etched into every plank of the ship. Lysander stood at the helm, his frostbitten arm now whole, but strangely lighter, as though something within him had been burned away. The crew worked in solemn silence, casting occasional glances at their captain. He had returned from the island of eternal winter alone, carrying no treasure save for the warmth that now radiated faintly from his once frozen chest. They did not ask what had transpired in the mountain, nor did Lysander offer an explanation. Some truths were meant to be borne alone. Ahead, the sky darkened, heavy clouds rolling in like the shadow of a great hand. The northern reaches loomed once more, their icy peaks sharp against the horizon. Lysander's fingers tightened on the wheel as the memory of the Snow Queen's gaze flickered in his mind. She had cursed him, yes, but she had also given him a chance. That much he understood now. The Snow Queen's domain was as he had left it. Endless ice stretching in every direction, the wind howling like a mournful chorus. The frostfire came to a halt, her anchor biting into the frozen sea. Lysander descended to the ice alone, leaving the crew behind. This was a journey he had to finish himself. As he trudged through the frost, the cold no longer bit at him. The flame of everlasting spring had left a warmth within him, a reminder of the sacrifice he had made. It guided him now, a beacon in the frozen desolation. The Snow Queen appeared as suddenly as before, her form materializing from the whirling snow. She stood tall and serene, her pale features framed by a cascade of silver hair. Her gaze fell upon Lysander, and a faint smile curved her lips. "You return," she said, her voice smooth and cold. "Few would be so bold." Lysander stopped a few paces away, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You cursed me to carry the frost within my soul, but you also showed me the path to melt it. I've come to fulfill your bargain." The Snow Queen tilted her head, her icy eyes narrowing. "You speak of bargains as though you understand them. Tell me, Captain, what did you give to reach this moment?" "My greed," Lysander replied. His voice was steady, though the weight of his sacrifice pressed against him. "The last piece of my past, the pendant that tied me to the man I used to be." The Snow Queen regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a graceful motion, she extended her hand. The snow beneath Lysander's feet began to glow, forming a circle of frost that shimmered with an otherworldly light. "Step forward," she commanded. Lysander hesitated, the memory of his reflection in the Guardian's mirror fresh in his mind. The Snow Queen's gaze was unwavering, her outstretched hand as still as the ice itself. Slowly, he stepped into the circle, the warmth of the flame within him meeting the cold of her domain. The Snow Queen placed her hand over his heart. Her touch was freezing, but it didn't hurt. Instead, it seemed to draw something from within him. A lingering shadow, a fragment of the frost that had once consumed him. "You have learned the cost of greed," she said softly. "But tell me, Captain, what will you do with the warmth you now carry?" Lysander met her gaze, his green eyes steady. "I'll protect it, share it. I'll be better than the man who came here seeking only treasure." The Snow Queen's smile deepened, and for the first time there was warmth in her expression. Then the curse is lifted. The glow beneath Lysander's feet flared, enveloping him in a radiant light. The frost that had clung to his soul melted away, replaced by a profound sense of clarity. The Snow Queen stepped back, her form becoming insubstantial, a shimmering figure against the endless white. "Go now, Captain," she said, her voice fading like the last breath of winter. "Spring comes for us all." When Lysander returned to the Frostfire, the ice that surrounded the ship had vanished, replaced by the gentle lapping of waves. The crew greeted him with cautious relief, their eyes searching his for answers he did not give. As the ship sailed south, the frostbitten lands of the northern reaches gave way to the first green shoots of spring. Lysander stood at the helm, the pendant's absence a quiet ache in his chest, but the warmth of the flame carried him forward. The Snow Queen's words echoed in his mind. "Spring comes for us all." For the first time in his life, Lysander understood that the greatest treasures were not taken, but earned. And so, with the winds of spring at his back, the captain of the Frostfire sailed toward the horizon, no longer searching for gold, but for a way to be the man the warmth had made him.